of the orphan and widow. Take care of our own flesh and blood. 'Cause this is the way that you've called us to love, to share what we had with the hungry and poor, put clothes on the naked and heal up the broken and torn. True religion.
All right, welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name's Chris,
And I'm Mike.
and we are now starting the last chapter in the book of Galatians, chapter 6, and we're just going to jump right in. So, Mike, you want to get us started?
In Galatians chapter 6 here, verses 1 through 10 is kind of what we're going to be looking at. In the first couple of verses here, Paul gives us some really good advice, some really practical advice about mature Christian brothers in various ways. So let's just jump in here to chapter 1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. So Paul begins here with some very practical advice. If anyone is caught in any transgression, this begins a few verses where Paul lays out some ideas on how a Christian is supposed to treat someone who is caught up in a transgression or sin of any type. It says here that we as Christians who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. The word here we translate as spiritual is interesting, at least to me, in that it comes from the Greek word pneumatikos. We can learn a lot if we look at the background of this word in light of Paul's use of the word. If you go through and kind of read every place that Paul used this word, it appears that pneuma, or the Spirit, to Paul has a sense of the unveiling of the mystery of God and salvation. While the Spirit formerly rested on national Israel and on individuals on occasion, the fact that believers now have the Spirit of God to rely on in them and through them, he is saying you who are pneumia, or of the Spirit, or relying on the Spirit of God, should restore him in gentleness. Now this concept of gentleness is important as well, in that we need to love our neighbors as ourselves. We encountered the word for gentleness earlier in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22, where it's listed as a work of the Spirit. And finally, we need to be especially careful that we watch ourselves, because oftentimes sin is like leaven, or leaven. I don't think we've actually figured out how to pronounce that one correctly. A little bit of leaven, a little bit leavens the whole lump. And we need to make sure that we do not get infected with the same sins as well. Chris?
Cool. That's good. Brethren, the verse says, brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye that which are spiritual, restore such a one, and in spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. The section we're going to cover today, in fact, the whole 10 verses could be titled like burden bearing. It's going to show us a lot of different ways to bear one another's burdens. And this particular aspect is going to deal with somebody that has sinned in some way. The word that it uses, overtaken, if anyone be overtaken in a fault, is it's a word in the Greek that kind of means like suddenly caught, like in a race, somebody that was running a good race, and all of a sudden somebody just zooms past them. They didn't see it coming. And it's like that sometimes in our lives, even when we think that we have certain things dealt with, certain sins and things like that, it might come up to bite us again. But his admonition here is, if that happens, as we're going to look at what to do with that. But I just want to mention really quickly, I think that's one of the really good reasons that part of the Lord's Prayer, lead us not to temptation, is there, just to, on a daily effort to say that. I think to go through a day, without having, really ask the Lord to, He wants us to, obviously, with it being in the Lord's prayers, to ask Him to help us with those temptations is something that I think it's almost dangerous not to go through your day like that, I guess, in some way. But anyway, ye which are spiritual, that was something that I'm glad you hit, because who's spiritual among us? I mean, our kind of idea of spiritual means like only those. Who's the spiritual one here? Help the person, But the idea here is non-carnal, one who is walking in the Spirit. In the last chapter, it really kind of put that home of like who that is. It's kind of like while all Christians would, by definition, have the Spirit of God, you can also choose to walk in the Spirit. It's kind of like you do choose on a daily basis which one you're going to walk in as well.
You might even say moment by moment.
Right.
Very extreme about it.
Mm-hmm. It's used in a lot of different places. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 1, "And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto the spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ." 1 Peter says, 2 verse 5 says, "Ye also as lively stones are built up as a spiritual house, and a holy priesthood, and offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ." And it goes on. There's a lot of different verses here. Restore such a one. The idea there is kind of like mending a net is where we see it used other places in the Bible, but also like setting a broken bone. So it has this real gentle idea of how you restore such a one. And in fact, that's sort of the way it says to do it. Restore such a one in a spirit of meekness. And it's kind of like how do you if somebody's done something where you feel like you want to help them with it. It's the whole idea of you're trying to bear their burdens with them, and to do so in a spirit of meekness. And it says kind of how to do that is to consider thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Is to sort of do it in this idea that it could easily just as easily be you. And I think a lot of times you might see somebody that's in some sin, whether it be drunkenness or some sort of substance abuse situation, and you're like, well, brother, I would never find myself in that situation, to quote Guzik. But that's not the spirit of meekness. The spirit of meekness is that could easily be you, and I think that causes the spirit of, or that causes meekness is by considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. And that's really sort of the whole of this idea, it seems like. And I'm going to quote one real quick from Vincent Word Studies here that says, "The exhortation is addressed to the conscience of each. Before you deal severely with the erring brother, consider your own weakness and susceptibility to temptation, and restore him in view of that fact." And the final kind of similar verses in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, where it says, "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." Mike?
Good stuff.
Thanks.
Let's see. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Now this phrase made me think of the book of James, actually, where James writes, "Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world." Paul wrote, as I mentioned earlier, he wrote that we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. Excuse me. Both Paul and James agree with John, who writes in 1 John, "For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another." Now, all of these people agree with Jesus, of course, who says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you." So this idea of bearing one another's burdens and loving one another is all expressed in slightly different ways, but we see it popping up again and again and again in everybody's, that is the gospel writers, everybody's writing, Jesus, John, Paul, James, and really it's so foundational to the other-centeredness aspect of the gospel. It really cannot be overstated. That's why Paul writes here, "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Chris?
Right. This continuing again with the bear one another's burdens idea. In this context, the burdens are sin burdens. When a brother or sister sins, we should look at it in meek restoration and the mending of that brokenness. This is a quote from Calvin. "The weakness or sins under which we groan are called burdens. This phrase is singularly appropriate in an exhortation to kind behavior, for nature dictates to us that those who bend under a burden ought to be relieved. He enjoins us to bear the burdens. We must not indulge or overlook sins by which our brethren are pressed down, but relieve them, which can only be done by mild and friendly correction. You know, I've been thinking about this, and it's like we don't really see in your day-to-day life you're wanting to help somebody with their sins. You know, I mean, we think about helping people with just about every other thing. But I know both of you and I have just recently dealt with individuals that, you know, we're talking to and helping in a spiritual sort of way, and they kind of are looking for spiritual guidance. In that case, their sins are actually a big part of their the thing that separate them from joy and stuff. So in that case, it's really important to help them relieve the burden, because they might not see it in that situation, but it's the sin itself that's actually causing the rest of the problems in a lot of, or you know, at least a big part of it.
Yeah.
But it says here to do this, to bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And that's a pretty interesting phrase. It's a really uncommon expression, this law of Christ expression. May be referring to John 13, verses 34 and 35, where it says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." That's a pretty strong statement, the idea that I've determined a way, you know, God has determined a way that you're going to know, they're going to know that you're mine, and that's to love
other people.
Right, and
yeah,
Paul in the last chapter says it pretty boldly, and he says, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So it's a pretty heavy thing to, you know, see somebody that's struggling with it, and it doesn't matter for whatever reason or whatever the thing is. It's you know, it's something that we should do. It's kind of like he's saying to the Galatians, who have been during this whole time dealing with these legalists who are coming down on them for not fulfilling the law. It's almost like Paul is saying, "Okay, guys, you want to follow the law? Here's the law. You know, do this law." And I stole that from David Guzik, by the way.
The law of love, indeed. Galatians, verse 3, chapter 6. "For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself." Now, in comparing ourselves to the atoning work and life of our glorious Savior Jesus, comparing ourselves is going to show us the obviousness that we do not merit. Within the context of the previous verse, we need to be sure to not become proud when all we do is carry the burdens that God has given us, especially when we see others stumble. You know, as Chris said, you know, coming alongside and helping other people in their sins is certainly important. We need to be, as James puts it, doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving ourselves. Now, the other end of the spectrum is implicit here in verses 5 and 6, as we'll see later. If we are intentionally putting ourselves down and saying, "Oh, I'm just not as smart as you. You're so intelligent and well-read when it comes to Greek. I just can't compete." When all along you have like a PhD in Greek or a master's degree in Greek. At least to me, you're sort of committing the opposite side of this quote. You are thinking that you are nothing when you are something. It's sort of a sense of false pride, really. If you are called to leadership, be humble about it, but don't shirk away from it, you know, like Moses did, trying to pretend he was nothing when God himself told him he was to go and do something. And likewise, if anyone thinks he is something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself.
Cool.
Share what we had with the hungry and poor. Put clothes on the naked and heal up the broken and torn.
All right, welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name's Chris.
And I'm Mike.
And we are now starting the last chapter in the book of Galatians, chapter 6. And we're just going to jump right in. So, Mike, you want to get us started?
Yeah. In Galatians chapter 6 here, should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. So Paul begins here with some very practical advice. If anyone is caught in any transgression, this begins a few verses where Paul lays out some ideas on how a Christian is supposed to treat someone who is caught up in a transgression or sin of any type.
Take care of the orphan and widow. Take care of our own flesh and blood. 'Cause this is the way you've called us to love.
Here, verses 1 through 10 is kind of what we're going to be looking at. In the first couple of verses here, Paul gives us some really good advice, some really practical advice about mature Christian brothers in various ways. So let's just jump in here to chapter 1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual